If you don't go far enough back in memory or far enough ahead in hope, your present will be impoverished. I know at this event you've spent some time going back in memory, and in this session we want to go ahead and hope, and we have just a few minutes to do it. I want to talk about demographic trends briefly. I want to say something about philanthropy or philanthropic trends, say a word about communication and technology, about public agency, and about the environment. Nothing is more predictable or anticipatable about the future than the shape and the nature of the population. And nothing is more clear regarding what's happening in our country than the increasing diversity in our country. The Census Bureau consistently reports that up to a third of our nation now are minorities. And by 2050, more than half of our nation are or will be minorities. And at that point, the whole term will become kind of an oxymoron. Thus, the demand to deal with diversity, the demand to be more diverse as an organization, both in terms of volunteers and to think more in terms of diversity as we consider the services that we provide, is significant. 54% of new immigrants settle in cities of more than 5 million. That contrasts to 27% of those born in the U.S. who live in such big cities. The immigrant population of our day is moving into urban areas, and therefore it's an urban issue. Migration for work continues and will continue so long as there are income disparities in the world and an opportunity to move. And we'll try to do some things to get better control of that here in the next few years, I'm sure, but this migration for work is very likely to continue for the foreseeable future. And therefore, diversity in the population will be something that we are consistently dealing with. In addition to diverse populations, we live in a population that is so much older that it is, in some senses, a disruptive phenomenon in our world. It's not unheard of historically to live to be 65, but it was relatively rare. Benjamin Franklin was over 65, of course. At the turn of the century, only 13% of the U.S. population was over 65. Now it's about 12%, but by 2025, nearly 25% of the population will be over 65, some 50 million more people over the age of 65. On January 1, 2011, just 1,692 days from today, the first baby boomer will turn 65. And then for the next couple of decades, we'll have a tidal wave of challenge of an older population. But what we will really have when it comes to volunteer organizations like the Red Cross is a tidal wave of opportunity to engage a post-65 generation in this organization. 63% of people in that generation say they don't intend to retire, they're not interested in retire, and we have confronting us in the next few decades a major opportunity to engage a post-65-year-old population in the kind of work that you do. At the same time, we have 60 million young people exemplified by our two student speakers, kids born since 1980, the first digital native generation, the first generation to grow up with computers and with the World Wide Web. 60 million strong, almost as big as the baby boom generation. They are thinking differently. They are whizzes with technology. They're capable of multitasking, but most importantly, according to generational theory, they are an activist generation. And you probably see it with your own kids or your own grandkids. It's certainly true of my 3 kids. The youngest is 21. He's graduating from the University of Washington. He's on the leading edge of this digital native generation. And generational theory says that this generation will be another generation interested in change and in activism. And what you see in the young people that you engage in Red Cross is a generation interested in being active at making the world a better place. And along with that senior generation, which is coming in the next 2 decades, you'll have a youth generation, according to generational theory, interested in being active. And those two forces combined could lead to the greatest time of volunteerism in the history of the world. Finally, there is a demographic phenomenon which is intriguing and little known and was indicated by your responses to the question. We're on the verge of a decline of the human population beginning in the year 2050 or so on a global scale, but already underway in significant parts of the world. Russia is losing 700,000 people per year. China is approaching population decline potentially in 2030. Japan began population decline last year. Whole large parts of the world have more deaths than births because of declining birth rates all around the world. This will lead perhaps to the greatest challenge we've ever faced as humanity, but more importantly perhaps to the greatest opportunity we've ever had to rethink how do we want to live on the planet in terms of population growth versus population decline. Which should we encourage and what would be the proper policies? Demographics always offer you something you can understand about the future and offer both challenges and opportunities. In terms of philanthropy trends, two things clearly stand out. One, a tremendous challenge to the future of giving. It is quite clear that we're in a time period in which the gap between rich and poor is growing by most measures. And the middle class is being more and more squeezed by most measures. That means a growing wealthy class with large amounts of money to give, and therefore the creation of foundations and significant new large-scale programs by tapping into that group of people. But it means a squeeze on workplace giving because the middle class has always used the workplace as their primary point for giving. And as the middle class feels their budget to be extremely squeezed, and that appears to be the case in the next few years, the likelihood of their increasing their amount of giving diminishes. And therefore, the concentration to increase giving means that we have to increase participation in giving more so than the amount of giving from a squeezed middle class. And that's the number one challenge, I think, in terms of future giving over the next decade or so. The second thing that's happening in terms of philanthropy is something this organization is very familiar with, and that is an increasing demand for competency and transparency in a highly interconnected and, should we say, internet-blogged world. And all organizations, but in particular philanthropic organizations, will more and more be judged and be watched for transparency and for competence because of this highly interconnected communication world that we live in, where information just simply travels at the speed of light. Communication technology is a key to that, and there is a tremendous opportunity worldwide which is occurring in terms of disaster response related to communication technology, and that's the emergence of the cell telephone as the primary communications tool around the world. Did you know that 77% of the global population now lives within cell telephone range? And that changes how we can communicate and how quickly we can coordinate and do a whole variety of things. There is one technology trend which we don't know much about, although it's been in the news a lot in the last few years, and that's this new field of nanotechnology. Raise your hand if you've heard of nanotechnology. Most hands are going up now. What kind of opportunity is something as exotic as nanotechnology going to offer an organization like the Red Cross? The opportunity is this, something called micro, or really nano, water filtration. We know that one of the greatest needs at time of disaster, but really worldwide, even when there are no disasters, is the need for clean and drinkable water. Some 1.2 billion people on the planet, even short of disasters, don't have access to clean drinking water. Over half the hospital beds in the developing world are filled by people who are there because they are sick from waterborne illnesses. Clean water is one of the great challenges of our time of history. And because of nanotechnology and the development of nano water filtration, there is something as simple as a new Swiss invention called the Life Straw. Some of you might have heard of it or seen it. It's just simply a plastic straw. It costs about $2.50 or $3. You can put one end of it into the dirtiest water that you can imagine, and you can suck on the other end, and out the other end comes clean, drinkable water because of what's happening with science and technology through nanotechnology. In terms of public agency trends, what is going on is quite clear. The deficit that we are in the process of creating at a federal level in the United States will once again, for the next decade or two, create a tremendous drag on the ability of public agencies to flexibly and creatively respond to the issues of our day. Now, we will probably work our way through this again as we work our way through political elections and changes and so on over the next couple of decades. But for the next 2 decades or so, this deficit is going to be a tremendous drag. In terms of environmental trends, the last thing I want to talk about, I think it is in many ways the most significant thing confronting the Red Cross. It turns out that global warming is real. There is simply no denying it anymore, though deny it we might still wish to do. The planet is getting warmer, and the only question is how much warmer and how fast. Imagine the world covered with tables 1 meter square. On each table, put a cupcake to celebrate, let's say, a birthday. In each cupcake, put a candle and light that candle on fire. That candle will put out about 2.5 watts of heat energy. Because of merely the increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, because of human, industrial, and transportation activity, the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have gone from about 310 parts per million in 1950 to about 380 today. That difference of 70 parts per million heats up the planet by about 2.5 watts per square meter, or one birthday candle burning night and day on every birthday table 1 meter square over the whole planet. That's how much warmer the planet is getting. The Arctic is melting at twice the rate of the rest of the planet. That is, the ice is melting, and we saw in the questions how much it's melting. What this means is the potential in our lifetimes, not the next several centuries, but in our lifetimes, significant changes to weather patterns on the planet. Wild weather, in other words. As the planet heats up, the frequency and intensity of storms is likely to increase. This past summer, I was working at an event for the Federal Highway Administration as we tried to imagine what the advanced research on highways ought to be. At the event was a researcher from the Corps of Engineers who works on cold weather roads. And she talked about the melting in the Arctic and the work of the Corps of Engineers to help certain villages in Alaska move away from the coast, the first human migrations in response to global warming. And she said something that shook me that day in July last summer. She said, "You know, I have this feeling that because of global warming, the day will come when people begin to move away from the U.S. Gulf Coast as they throw up their hands and say, you know, I just can't live through another one." And then Katrina and the other storms of 2005 hit. Global warming is real. It means as an organization we're going to face wild weather over the next many decades. It's time to acknowledge it. It's time to do more than ever to get ready for it. And perhaps it's even time to begin lobbying for everything we can do to reduce the impact of global warming. 5 challenges face us as we imagine the future of the Red Cross, the next 125 years. Demographic trends, trends in philanthropy, trends in public agencies, opportunities with communication technology and other kinds of technology, and environmental trends. The question always is, so what do you do with that? What difference does it make? And we have an opportunity now to engage in some conversation with 3 of your colleagues who I invite to come on up, and we're going to have a short panel conversation. And then, as we're doing that, I'm going to invite those of you who would like to ask a question to me or a question to all of us.